Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 4th chapter in the book of Romans. And herein we witness Paul exalt Abraham as an exemplar of his doctrine of justification through faith more extensively than James does in the 2nd chapter of his books. We can also read that in James 21 through 2:21-25. But Paul gives this chapter a full 25 verses, so we got a lot to cover. We're going to keep our preamble as concise as possible, but as long as necessary. In the 17th verse of the 1st chapter, we read, Paul quote the Old Testament prophet Habakkuk, the just or the righteous shall live by faith. So that theme of righteousness by faith is connected to what we read in the 4th chapter, but in between he expounds on the doctrine of universal depravity. Chapter 1, verse 18-32, he lists the category and the sins of the Gentiles. Then in the 2nd chapter, he warns the Jews, who are you to judge of those who you are guilty? And then he says the Gentiles have their own standard of judgment, the conscience, inasmuch as you have the law. So he kind of diminishes the significance of the law, which exists to point to our sin condition, not to save us. And then he continues. There's 2 verses I want to read in the 3rd chapter. He quotes the psalmist, as it has been written, there is none righteous, no, not one. The one who wrote that was David in Psalm 14:1 and 14:3, and there is none righteous. Now, righteous means is a relative concept, at least when we're comparing humanity to divinity. When we come to divinity, he is a perfectly and intrinsically righteous being, and we have no righteousness apart from it to call our own, because we are all defiled by sin in some way or in some form. It comes to us all. We are all guilty and meriting the sin consequence which was assumed for us by the Savior. And he goes into more of the redemptive direction when he compares the second Adam and then gives life through the Messiah in the 6th chapter. 5th chapter is the second Adam, but here he holds Abraham, who was a pivotal figure not only for the Jewish people, but he exalts him as equally exemplary for the Gentile people, and we'll get on that more. But verse 23, for all have sinned and fallen short of the esteem of Elohim. So there's not a single one among us who has not sinned and slipped and fallen in any way, shape, or form at any point in our life. Some of us sin more than others, but we are all sinners nonetheless, and that is an inescapable reality, which and apart from the provision of the atonement, we would have no way of making it to everlasting life. And then he declares that for we reckon that if a man is justified right by faith without works of Torah, so there he establishes the momentum that he's giving life to the doctrine that he's intent on establishing through a human example. This makes the doctrine come alive. So the Bible is not only doctrine, it is also people, and we have to look at it in both lenses. Or is he the Elohim of the Jews only, and not also of the Gentiles? Yes, of the Gentiles also. So Paul tersely answers the question he asks, that he is their same creator. He made the Jews, and he made the Gentiles as well. And the reason that he made the Jews was to win these people to him. But this takes us to our next concept before we launch into the chapter on Abraham. We want to understand the dispensations of Judeo-Christianity. The first one was innocence. That was in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve were created undefiled by sin. Then they sinned and they grew a conscience as a response to the fallen nature. So that is our second dispensation. Then after the days of Noah, humanity wasn't a whole lot better than they were before, so he instituted the government as a dispensation to restrain the more wicked impulses of sinful humanity. Then in the 4th dispensation, this is when it gets Judeo-Christian, because before the Jews were a nation, before they were a law, they were an individual and a family, and he had this promise in the sky that in the sand below him, that as many dust as the sands as on the seashore and as many stars are in the sky, so too shall be the number of your descendants, and the greatest one was the Messiah. So he is a son of Abraham in the biological sense. but because he was saved by faith. Now the fifth dispensation is when the Jews get the law, and they had kind of misused it they didn't quite fully understand its true significance. Then the dispensation of grace, dispensation of church, this is the one that Paul was in. It is also the one we are now in. It is the longest dispensation. We have no idea when it will end, but the next dispensation which awaits us is the millennial kingdom. We do know that will last 1,000 years. Now this marks the lesson itself. Verse 1, chapter 4, book of Romans. What then shall we say Abraham our father to have found according to the flesh? Abraham is the father of the Jewish people in a literal, biological, fatherly way. They are his biological descendants, and his name translates as many nations. So, in fact, the Hebrew people were not the father of many nations, and the Hebrew people were not the only one, but they were the chosen one. He also, for example, sired the Midianites through a concubine that he conceived with after Isaac, and thus that nation was born. And before Isaac was his liaison with Hagar, the Egyptian slave girl, and her son Ishmael became the ancestor of the Arabic and Muslim people. But the words according to the flesh, that connects to the word we read works in the second verse. So why don't we read the second verse? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has boasting, but not before Elohim. So you can boast and proclaim and exalt yourself on a pedestal and put yourself up for all the good that you do, but it's not going to amount to nothing when you get to heaven, because we have no goodness to call our own. We cannot work our way to heaven. This is not a source for boasting, because once he gets there, he's not going to be boasting, because if he didn't earn his salvation, because what that does is it cancels the grace. It places our maker in our debt. So we got to rid ourselves of that impious imagining that we can work our way to salvation. We can work our fingers to the bones. That will not save us. It is faith, and as Abraham was justified by faith, so too are we. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed Yahweh, and it was reckoned to him for righteousness. Now, the original language translation shouts as say amen. So Abraham's faith was, he said amen when God called him to be a wandering nomad. First of all, he had a comfortable life as a denizen of Ur, which was a civilized society by the standards of the day, and he was called to wander the earth as a nomad before seeing and settling in the land that would be his nations. But he believed Yahweh. What Yahweh said, he delivered. He told him he would be the father of the chosen nation through his wife, who was past childbearing age. This takes us all the way back to Genesis 17 or 15, that range. Or actually, she's declared barren as early as the 11th chapter of Genesis. But the point is that he had this fantastic promise that even though they were well past the childbearing age, they would conceive a son through whom the nation, which would bear the Redeemer of the world, would be carried in his loins. And he eventually sired Jacob and Esau. The blessing went to Jacob, whose sons became the 12 tribes, the 12 patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel. And it was reckoned to him for righteousness. This is Genesis 15:6. That it was so because he believed, it was not because he did anything. It was because he believed the promise, and that was the reckoning of the righteousness was imputed to him for believing and not for doing anything. And to him who is working, the reward is not reckoned as a grace, but as a debt. So this mentality, this legalistic mentality, it's when you devote your life to doing works of the flesh, works that can be seen, works that can be measured. You can count how much you tithe. You can count how many days you fast. You can count how many times a day you pray and all that other stuff. But it's not going to make a difference because our visible works are invisible not invisible, but Yahweh truly discerns us through our hearts. Faith is a heart matter. You have to surrender your own identity to one greater than you and just trust him for all that he says, and let him guide you in all that you do, and your life will be richer for it. But the whole grace and as a debt, so the legalistic mindset enslaves the legalistic practitioner of religion into thinking that God owes them salvation, and so it cancels and nullifies and eliminates grace for them. And to him who is not working, but believes on him who is justifying the wicked, his belief is reckoned for his righteousness. So one who is not working, but he believes on him who is declaring right the wicked, that means they have a false, misplaced sense of faith in the wrong being, the wrong entity, the wrong force. So that is a misapplied faith. But even his belief is reckoned for righteousness, because within the error of faith of a young man, there exists theoretically unlimited theoretical redemptive potential in even the most fallen and wayward of sinners. We can look to Paul himself as an example of this. He's our living example for that, the truth of that doctrine, in as much as Abraham is his human exemplar of the doctrine of justification through faith. But he also moves on to David, so he justifies this concept through David, also a significant figure, the king, the greatest king of the nation, which sprang from Abraham's loins. Even as David also says of the blessing of the man to whom Elohim reckons righteousness without works. Blessed are those whose lawlessness are forgiven, and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man to whom Yahweh shall by no means reckon sin. So this is a citation of the 32nd Psalm. This is a psalm of forgiveness, and I personally believe it was written after Psalm 51, when he reaches the state of brokenness through which he mourns over his sin and is completely broken by it, and that's the attitude we ought to be. And he expresses the brokenness in the 51st Psalm. Psalm 32 is about the joy of forgiveness, and he was declared forgiven by Samuel in 2 Kings 12, 15. Yeah, that's the one. But that's enough about that. How then was it reckoned, being in circumcision or in uncircumcision? Not in circumcision, but in uncircumcision. So he's falling back to Abraham, who is the protagonist of this chapter, and he wasn't circumcised until Genesis 17. This is 14 years after when he was declared righteous through faith in Genesis 15:16, a passage of 14 years elapsed before he was already justified, and he was given the ceremonial seal of the circumcision. But Paul says it is to no avail, not only in the earlier chapters, the second chapter especially, if an uncircumcised one, he says it all through the tail end. But for circumcision indeed profits if you practice the Torah, but if you are a transgressor of the Torah, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. So if you're going to bound yourself to the law, that means you have to bound it in its entirety. Their circumcision cannot seal you or protect you from the penalty of the law. Your faith can. So faith by the Gentile, if they exercise faith, that is... So if an uncircumcised one watches over the righteousness of the Torah, shall not his uncircumcision be reckoned as circumcision? So if they honor the law in their own way, in their conscience at least, it is possible to do good works apart from a knowledge of God, but that's going to take us in a direction far away from here. I want to get back to the 11th verse. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith in uncircumcision, for him to be a father of all those believing through uncircumcision, for righteousness to be reckoned to them also. So his descendants had elevated beyond a realistic measure the significance of the circumcision. It was a simple physical sign, and they were working after the flesh, so they took a lot of stock in the flesh. But the flesh is no substitute for faith. It's not enough to have the foreskin of your penis slit open. You have to have faith in order to be properly aligned in a way that you're going to merit his good reckoning, that being that of Elohim. But he's also the father of the Gentiles for those believing through the uncircumcision. The uncircumcision is the Gentiles, so he's using them as their spiritual father, as we discussed before getting to the opening verse. And the father of circumcision to those who are not only of the circumcision, but who also walk in the steps of the faith which our father Abraham had in uncircumcision. So Abraham was consistently and continually faithful before, during, and after the circumcision. He was 99 years old. He lived to be 175. That's past his midway point in his life when he was circumcised, and so too was Isaac at the very least. And Isaac's descendants, Abraham's descendants through Isaac, had sort of exalted that beyond its necessary significance within, certainly by the New Testament time. For the promise that he should be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. So the inheritor of these exalted promises, the promise that through his loins would spring a nation with as many people as there are stars in the sky and sand on the seashore, that just it's going to be beyond measure. And the meek shall inherit the earth, we learn in New Testament Beatitudes, Matthew 5:5. But it was not through the law, because Abraham didn't even have the law, yet he obeyed without the law. So obedience is possible apart from the law, and it's still useful to the Christian to study, and is the great answer as to whether the law is fulfilled, what parts of it are abolished. I covered that in Corey Johnston, Matthew 5:17 through 37, raising the bar on the Mosaic law. So the law is actually, he doesn't minimize the obligations. He, in fact, dramatically expands them, as we read in that chapter. For if those who are of the law are heirs, faith has been made useless, and the promises have been nullified. So if they put this law, which is not of salvific significance, its purpose is to point to your sin, and that should point you to your Redeemer, so you cannot seek and find your salvation in the law itself. It is a mirror which beholds the dirt, but it cannot cleanse the dirt. It can point us to our Redeemer who can forgive us. So it's all useless, and the promise has been nullified if you seek your salvation in the law, because that is not how Yahweh called Abraham, and it's not how he calls any of us. We are not to seek our salvation in what we do. We don't have to do anything but believe, or be anybody but a believer, in order to be saved. For the law works out wrath, for where there is no law, there is no transgression. So the law, there are consequences and penalties to the law, and that is likened to wrath, which can be a divine righteous judgment. When Yahweh resorts to wrath, it is always and only righteous. Man, not so much. But if there is no law, there's still the law establishes and classifies and categorizes sin for what it is. So without it, there would be no sin. But so the law is useful to point to the sin, and that can point you to the source of your salvation. It's a schoolmaster to a progressive greater layer of revelation. And the law was not the supreme form of revelation that the New Testament Jews thought it was. The supreme form was in the flesh, in the body, the incarnation, and he dwelled among Abraham's seeds, and they were the ones who killed him. On account of it all, it is of faith that it be according to grace, for the promises to be made certain to all the seed, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who are of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. So the father of us all is the Jews and Gentiles. Paul establishes the unity and equality of the Jews and Gentile. He was the one to whom was entrusted that mystery. We can read of that most fully in Ephesians 3. Grace and faith through grace. This brings us to mind Ephesians 2:8. For it is been by grace you have been saved, not by works, lest no one can. But the combination is we are saved by grace, but it's through faith. So we have to access the enabling and empowerment of the atonement through faith. But it is a provision of grace that is only efficacious to the faithful. And this faithful includes Jew, Gentile. All you have to do is believe. You don't have to be anybody. You don't have to belong to any race of people or anything else. As it has been written, I have made you a father of many nations, in the presence of him who he believed, even Elohim, who gives life to the dead, and calls that which does not exist as existing. So Abraham's name literally translates as the father of the many nations. Remember, he's not only the father of the Hebrew people, but also the Arabic and Islamic and the Midianites. So he was the father of many nations, and his original name, Abram, was exalted father, but I believe Abraham more fully translates as father of many nations. Or I could be incorrect, but he was in the presence, and faith enables our access to the presence of our Maker. All we have to do is believe, and then he is there, and he gives life to the dead. He is our resurrector and our redeemer, and he can bring anything. He is the creator, so anything he wills becomes into existence. So that which has no existence prior to his conceiving it and bringing it about into being, it's just not there. But he made us who previously didn't exist into existing beings, and he also provides us an eternal existence, the formula of which I'm afraid to even go that far. I got to get back on track. Who against hope believed in hope that he should become father of many nations, according to what is said, so shall your seed be. So he had to hope against hope. This is human hope. So when all human hope had exhausted the avenues of possibility, he had only one place to turn that hope, and that was above, to Yahweh in the sky, exalted in heaven. So whenever our hopes are disappointed in earth, and friends are going to disappoint our hopes, and bosses and just everything else, people are going to disappoint our hopes in this world that we live. But that only increases our reliance on the one who can give us hope in our hopeless situations. And Abraham thought he had a hope. Humanly speaking, he had a hopeless situation. He was a 99-year-old man with an 86-year-old wife, well past the age of conceiving, yet they sired Isaac in their old age. And through him became the nation. And not having grown weak in faith, he did not consider his own body, having already dead, being about 100 years old, in the deadness of Sarah's womb. So he was 100 years old, about 100, so he was 99 years old when he conceived of Isaac. He may have been 100 when he was born, but he says about, so that's an approximation. It's not to be taken too literally. And the deadness of Sarah's womb, I believe she was 86 at the same time, so that's just beyond possible. That is almost, it's microcosmically miraculous in proportion to the virgin birth in its own way. But he did not hesitate about the promise of Elohim through unbelief, but he was strengthened in belief, giving esteem to Elohim. So there was no cause for question. Abraham had an unquestioning obedience. He brought his son to the slaughter. He did not reckon his own his own son's, he was ready to take his son's own body dead. And when he, in the previous verse, when we read his own body dead, that means beyond the ability to conceive. But he had an unhesitating, and faith is action, and faith means now. So you cannot hesitate in matters of faith, because once you hesitate, you surrender ground to our spiritual enemy, whose one of his weapons is unbelief, and doubt is different from unbelief. It's not sinful to challenge every assumption and question every claim, but unbelief, a doubting mind struggles to believe, and we can use those doubts, and it's better to doubt out loud than harbor unbelief in silence, because where a doubter struggles to believe, an unbeliever refuses to believe. So they are stuck on that mindset. There's just nothing that's going to persuade them. They are stuck there, and that is a sin. And being completely persuaded that what he had promised, he was also able to do. Yahweh's word is as good as gold. His promises can materialize things into existence that weren't into existence, such as, for instance, Isaac conceived through his elderly wife's womb. So he had faith in the promise the whole time, and he witnessed to live the miracle and lived to tell the tale. And Moses recorded his life story by biography, inspired directly by the Ruach Kodesh, as an example that we may learn from. He is our father too. Well, I don't have any Jewish blood, but he is my spiritual father, in the sense that he was justified as faith, and as it was with him, so too it must be with I, you, and everyone else. Therefore also it was reckoned to him for righteousness. So this repeats what we read in the 5th verse, and in Genesis 15:16, this was established to him for righteousness, and there was an element of belief. So there's no mention of him bringing Isaac to the as a sacrificial altar or anything else. He just believed unquestioningly, and we must have the same unquestioning obedience that he did. But also because of us, to whom it shall be reckoned, to us who believe in him, who raised up Yahshua our Master from the dead. So this takes a sudden doctrinal turn to the resurrection, which is the most controversial yet crucial claim of our faith. And Paul said, if the resurrection isn't real, my preaching is in vain, in 1 Corinthians, and I refuse to believe that he lied, and I refuse to believe that it was in vain. I believe the resurrection is real, and we need to grab it, lay hold of it, because if we doubt it, then it's not going to be, if whether you believe or you don't believe, you are correct. So if you don't believe in the resurrection, good luck in the afterlife, but it's really imperative that our faith be centered on the most subliminal truth of our faith. Who was delivered up because of our trespasses and was raised for us and to be justified. So our justification comes from faith, but it is also enabled by the atonement. Abraham didn't even have an atonement. There was no lowercase letter a atonement, because the Mosaic law was yet into effect, yet there was a sacrificial element, such as when he tithed to Melchizedek, the king of Salem, in Genesis 14, and when he sacrificed his own son in the 22nd chapter, he was willing to bring him up there, but that mimics his only begotten, his beloved son, the sacrifice portrays the sacrifice of the Son, just the willingness to go through it and the faith to not even question why he is going through it. That points ultimately to our Redeemer. So in Isaac and in Abraham, we have a typological allusion to the Redeemer through whose seed they would sire. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to see you. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.